I'm Chris Baker. I'm the Executive Director of the Pembina Institute. So I'm talking to you today from Calgary, the ancestral territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the bands of Goodstoney, Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Tsuut'ina Dene, in the Otimpuis-Squak Métis government of the Métis Nation within Alberta's Districts 5 and 6. I am grateful to be here today with you as a guest and a neighbor on these traditional Indigenous lands. Before we dive into today's packed agenda, I'd like to step back a little bit. Why did an environmental think tank, the Pembina Institute, collaborate with labor organizations and labor market experts at this moment in time? The mainstream discourse is that climate advocates only care about climate change and reducing emissions, while labor groups are really focused on jobs, and that somehow these two imperatives are mutually exclusive. And as we all know, this is a false narrative. We know that climate policy is economic policy, and the choices we make today will shape our economy for decades to come, and will determine the kinds of jobs that are available to Canadians in the future. So Pembina, like and other climate advocacy organizations and labor groups, are finding ways to become increasingly aligned on the kind of future we want to build. We want to build a net zero aligned economy because the world is moving in that direction very fast. The US and Europe are investing heavily in climate action, and there's a fierce competition to be among the first countries in the world to build a completely net zero electricity grid, which will become the backbone of net zero economies around the world. Canada is out there in the international marketplace trying to compete for scarce investment capital and to attract net zero aligned industries and manufacturing. And countries, especially China, are beginning to be very strategic about locking up critical resources and owning the supply chains that are essential for a modern net zero economy. So Canada needs a plan. And we made our own contribution towards that plan, working with the Canadian Labour Congress on a sustainable jobs blueprint. And today we'll dive deeper into that, and you'll find out more about how Canada is one step closer towards a robust workforce planning for a net zero economy, thanks to the Sustainable Jobs Act, which is currently in the Senate. And we'll also look at the brighter future that such planning would deliver for Canada. So I'd like to now turn it over to Megan Gordon of the Pembina Institute and Alex Callahan of the Canadian Labour Congress, who will talk about their work and introduce our expert panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today for this webinar on workers leading the energy transition. We're here to lend insight into the question of how Canada can support workers and communities as our economy changes over the next several decades. And of course, as Chris mentioned, this is a timely question. We know that the effects of climate change are visible now than ever, and workers have questions about what a labor market looks like in a future where we rely less on fossil fuels and more on clean industries. And of course, we're also hopeful that Bill C-50, the Canadian Sustainable Jobs Act, will be becoming law in the coming days. And of course, we'll speak to the significance of this act momentarily, but to start off, I'd like to introduce myself and my co-host. So my name's Megan Gordon. I'm a senior analyst on Pembina's Equitable Transition team, and I'm joined by my colleague, Alex Callahan, the Director of Health, Safety and Environment at the Canadian Labour Congress. So our team has had the pleasure of working with Alex in the Congress for well over a year, and we'd like to start off today's conversation by sharing some of the work we've undertaken together in what we refer to as the Sustainable Jobs Blueprint series. But first, I'll just touch on a few housekeeping notes. We'd like to flag that any tech issues participants are experiencing can be sent to Green Living. We will be making a recording of this webinar available to panelists and will be posted on Pembina Institute's website at the end. And also don't forget that there are questions you can pose to panelists through the chat function that we'll be monitoring, and we will endeavor to answer once we get to the end. So for now, I will pass it over to Alex.
Thank you very much, Megan. I can't seem to turn my camera on, so perhaps the Green Living folks can help me out with that. There we go. Ask and you shall receive. Oh, almost. Okay, I'm going to not worry about my video, and I'm going to try to figure that out in the break between slides. So this project began in 2022 out of a discussion with Enercan, which sought to answer the question: as the economy is decarbonizing, what do workers want to see in terms of policy? What kind of goals can these policies achieve? What would they actually look like? And what would they mean for the economy writ large? So the CLC partnered with Pembina to bring forward a series of recommendations and reports that spoke to both jobs and to meeting our climate targets. I think it was a pretty powerful message for government to hear an environmental NGO and Canada's National Labour Central speaking about this together, because it really speaks to both parts of that equation. And so the recommendations that we developed came in two reports, two blueprints, if you will. They were based on consultations that we had with labor unions, with individual workers in high-emitting sectors, with experts across Canada, looking at the experience of other similar developed economies around the world and how they're decarbonizing and working to support workers. And we did some modeling to understand how some of these policies might actually impact Canada and Canadians as we move towards our 2050 targets.
So we also look to answer the question of what's driving change in our energy economy. And so we understand from research that global trends will have a significant impact on Canada's domestic industries and workforce. And that includes everything from the global price of oil to automation to investment behavior, and then of course, climate policies that were made in Canada and internationally. And that's particularly true that these changes are unfolding in rural and resource-dependent places where reliance on export markets can create more vulnerabilities and result in cycles of booms and busts, which have already altered the shape of these communities permanently. And so that's why the message of preparedness is at the core of our work. We know that there's more changes coming and that the energy transition is happening much faster than we anticipated in many instances, and that it's up to the government to ready itself to capitalize on the opportunities and avoid some of the predictable disruptions that we can expect. So the transition to net zero presents a massive opportunity for workers, and we know that there'll be growth generated by decarbonizing buildings, transportation, our energy systems, as well as clean manufacturing, and of course, all of the different supply chains and spin-off jobs that are associated with these sectors as well. So right now, many sectors are experiencing work shortages, and we have the chance to better align our plans for climate action and industrial growth with jobs and people plans and address these things holistically. And so that means looking at the current state of our labor market. It means engaging with workers, youth, and equity-deserving groups, Indigenous people, and other Canadians to course correct.
So our reports were built with a series of principles that we wanted to underlie the recommendations that we were making. So the first is that workers need a seat at the table. There is an adage that if you are not at the table, you are on the menu, and workers need that voice. It's also a key to commitments that Canada's made through the ILO, to the ILO guidelines on just transition and the commitment to just transition in the Paris Agreement. Secondly, we want to put forward policies that see no net job loss and frankly, not net loss of job quality. So how can we put forward policies that make sure that workers have the opportunity to continue to work and frankly, that see the quality of their work either be maintained or improve as we meet net zero targets? We wanted to articulate policies that provided a clear pathway from workers. So it is all well and good to, for example, create new jobs in a low carbon economy, but workers who are in high emitting sectors and whose work is declining need a way to get from where they are to where they're going to be. We need to build pathways for people to enter the workforce in these new clean economy or low carbon sectors. We need to see adaptable plans that match changing circumstances. So some of that can be, we need to make sure that we have flexibility as time passes, but we also need to recognize that not every solution is going to apply in every community and not every solution is going to apply to every workforce or in every industry. And we need to be adaptable in terms of the kinds of things we're putting forward. And the last thing is to proactively plan. This means we do not wait for the thunderstorm to start. We look for our umbrella now, and we make sure that we are ready, that we have policies in place, that we have training in place, and that we have a plan in place for the broad strokes of what we want to see in our economy and for the kinds of job quality measures we want to see for workers.
So that leads us to what the current state of action is. And so we look at Bill C-50, or the Canadian Sustainable Jobs Act, which has actually been in the works for several years. So when Canada began to increase its climate ambition in 2015, starting with the signage of the Paris Agreement, an agreement to cap global warming emissions at 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we also started to see labor groups start to be concerned about the impact would be for workers and communities. And so one of Canada's first steps was to commit to a phase out of coal as far as its domestic policies. And a just transition task force was struck with the leadership of labor to look at the impacts on workers and communities. And one of the key recommendations that was put forward to government from the work of this task force was to establish just transition legislation. So that's now what we're referring to as the Sustainable Jobs Act. So we're really pleased to see that we're getting closer to this becoming law. The bill was initially tabled in 2023. It was passed through the House in April and is now moving quickly through the Senate. And I'll turn it to Alex to talk a little bit about what this bill actually does.
So the Sustainable Jobs Act is framework for going forward. And I like to describe it a little bit like the funhouse mirror image of the Net Zero Emissions Act, which people may be more familiar with. In the way that the Net Zero Emissions Act has 5-year emissions reductions plans, or ERPs, this is going to set in place 5-year action plans that fill in the question of what happens with workers as we meet these targets. Those are the Sustainable Jobs Action Plans. In the same way as the Net Zero Emissions Act creates the NZAB, the Net Zero Advisory Body, the Sustainable Jobs Act creates the Partnership Council, Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council, which is a body for national social dialogue. It includes members from labor unions, from industry, from Indigenous organizations, and other experts who are going to provide ongoing independent advice, as well as evaluations of the action plans. And it creates a secretariat in the same, and similar to what the Net Zero Emissions Act does. In this instance, it's going to exist within NRCan, and its role is going to be to coordinate services that exist throughout government towards the Sustainable Jobs Act goals. As a for example, a lot of things we're going to talk about today actually live in ESDC. They don't necessarily live within NRCan. So the secretary within NRCan is tasked with making sure, frankly, the Herculean task of making sure that everybody is rowing in the same direction on this. Finally, it's important to note that the bill doesn't actually have any funding attached to it, which is a bit of a frustration, although by setting up this architecture, we can now have a role, we being workers can have a role in terms of setting the priorities for funding and for regulation going forward. And that's going to be what lives in those action plans. So I talked a little bit about the consultations we did directly with workers. So off the hop, we talked to 45 workers directly in high emitting sectors through focus groups and through one-on-one interviews. We then followed that up with a survey of 560 workers, also in high emitting sectors, unionized workers in both settings. So I suppose a couple things to take off the hop. Workers know climate change is real. They know it's happening. This is true irrespective of the industry in which these workers are working. Like, many of them have seen it in their day-to-day life. They also want to see a plan going forward. Now, poorly managed transitions do loom large. Megan talked a little bit about the Coal Transition Task Force. A lot of the recommendations out of that task force have not been fully acted on, and so people point to that as a source of frustration. The ground fishery in Newfoundland is another example. It's a cod fishery collapse. So these sorts of transitions which were not followed through on looms large. Now, this should be a warning to us that we need to get it right this time, and a reason that we're going to be sharp-elbowed in terms of making sure that there's funding and regulation that supports those sorts of things. Now, I want to share one interesting thing that happened, which was we tested the government's language around pathway to net zero, attitudes towards it. And then we went back and we tested a bunch of worker interventions or workforce interventions, training, pension supports, labor conditions on future investments, these sorts of things. And then went back and tested pathway to net zero. And when workers heard about what this could mean for them, about the kind of supports that could exist for them, their attitudes towards pathways to net zero actually improved. They weren't especially bad to begin with, but the point is that over a 10-minute online survey where they're seeing text, their attitudes improved about that. That's no marketing. That's not an ongoing discussion. That's not hearing directly from their worker representation, like their union, seeing something in their contract that actually speaks to some of these things. And then worker-supported policies on a variety of fronts, and we're going to talk a little bit more about these, although I think if you want to read the most, you should go and pick up report number 2, many of which we do not need to reinvent the wheel for. So it's strengthening things like employment insurance so that people can have an income while they train. So there's improvements that need to happen, but we can build on that backbone, making sure EI is there for workers in these kinds of transitions, making sure that there's skills training available to people so that they can have a recognized, accredited, a Red Seal, ideally, or whatever the training is that they need for their workplace, say in an industrial setting, that their skills recognition is transferable. Having early retirement options for workers who are close to the end of their career. Pension protections, hugely important. I cannot emphasize enough how important pensions were to workers. Having their union involved in bargaining for them in this process. There was one worker in an interview who said something along the lines of, well, the way I get all these other things is by having my union bargaining for me. And then the last thing that workers saw a lot of value in is investments in industries, as long as they're making sure that those investments support them.
So in partner to the work that we undertook with workers, we also undertook economic modeling. So we worked with Navius Research to model different pathways to net zero, to really see what was going to happen to the workforce and our economy. And in doing so, we found some good news. We found that more jobs are going to be created in 2050 than lost. So the model finds clean economy jobs grow by 1.6 million between 2020 and 2050, while we do see jobs decline related to fossil fuel production and use by 900,000. But in total, the model predicts that there'll be 2 million jobs in a net zero economy in 2050, and that we do see net job growth even in fossil fuel dependent provinces like Alberta. And again, we used a set of interventions, the ones that we spoke to with workers that Alex touched on, to really look at how that could change different outcomes. And again, the good news is with a plan in place and with a few set of strategic modeled interventions, we see that the worst impacts to those that are most vulnerable to transition are mitigated. Back to Alex to talk a little bit about what we put forward as a result of this work.
Yeah, so we made recommendations in two broad areas, the economy writ large and on workers. And so I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which we took some of these worker priorities and actually made policy recommendations around them. So the first thing is investments in skills training. And you'll see, if you read the report, you'll see a number of these things, investing in union training centers, for example, investing in not-for-profit training, so that the goal here is that people are able to train for a job, not just training for the sake of training, but training for a job with a recognizable credential that they can take with them. And in a nonprofit setting, we've seen instances where transitions have taken place and money's been thrown to for-profit institutions, and they do fine, and workers end up with the short end of the stick. The second is providing income security. And this is something I touched on a moment ago in terms of employment insurance, as well as I talked a little bit about pensions. And so we make some sort of more discrete recommendations around the kinds of EI reforms, pension bridges, pension protections that can be implemented so that workers have income support as they're moving from one job to another, as they're training. And again, these mostly don't involve reinventing the wheel. These are ways in which our existing EI system can be improved. The third is enabling a framework to uphold good job standards. This is kind of the $64,000 question of how we make clean economy jobs or low emitting jobs into good jobs. And so this can take a couple of forms. One example that people may be familiar with is things like the labor conditions that have been attached to low carbon investment tax credits. So these were conditions on these investments that included paying a prevailing wage or apprenticeships. There's also a series of labor code reforms that we talk about to make sure that jobs in emerging sectors, people can either form or join a union to improve their wages, to improve their job security, to improve the health and safety in their work, and to achieve the sort of union density, but also the union advantage for everybody in those new and emerging sectors. And then finally, continuing to talk to workers, making sure that the programs are working, making sure workers continue to have a seat at the table, because this will inevitably require ongoing negotiation and discussion. And I would also just note that while we have a body for national social dialogue, the engagement of workers and frankly employers as well is going to have to take place throughout our economy. Everything from that national social dialogue to provincial and territorial discussions to local discussions down to local bargaining.
And so on the economy-focused action side, we recommended a number of additional investments in regions, both to build resiliency in a net zero economy broadly, in the sense that we anticipate there's going to be changes really all across Canada, and everyone will require support in response to this influx of changes that we anticipate, but also more specifically in the sense that we expect some regions to be more vulnerable, and we want to see them supported in a way that responds to the challenge that they face. So our second economy-focused action also discusses this notion of net zero industrial policy, which we have defined as assembling a set of strategic government interventions that help both grow and create the conditions for thriving industries while also decarbonizing them. And then thirdly, we want to leverage private capital to support sustainable jobs because, of course, financing these efforts is no small feat. And so we've suggested a number of progressive taxation mechanisms that can support government in resourcing these efforts, with the caveat of the need for additional research in this particular area.
So what's next? We're at a really exciting moment here as we motor towards the end of June. The Sustainable Jobs Act had committee hearings, has gone through clause by clause, and we're expecting to be reported back, and we're expecting third reading and royal assent to be coming very, very soon. That means this bill will become law very, very soon. But this does not mean that we sit back, we lean back in the Muskoka chair, crack a beer, we hang a banner that says mission accomplished. It actually means that we need to work even harder because, as I mentioned, this is framework and it points towards the Sustainable Jobs Action Plans. It means that collectively, let me pull this apart. The Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council is going to have to hit the ground running in terms of the consultations with governments, workers across Canada, businesses, experts across a range of fields. And it's going to mean that governments are going to have to sharpen their pencils when it comes to the kinds of regulations that we're going to be looking to see, and in terms of the kinds of investments that are going to be conditional on labor supports that we're going to be looking for in everything from not-for-profit training to, as Megan was talking about, industrial supports, to building climate resilient infrastructure and making sure that when we do that work, we are supporting and creating good jobs in those sectors. So the point is, as much as we're coming to the end of this legislative process, our work is really, really just starting. And part of the reason that we were having this session is to talk about the ways in which the policies that we've put in place can act as a checklist for that first action plan and for the work of the Partnership Council.
So I think you've heard from us. I'm now pleased to introduce our panel and get to their skills and expertise and weigh in on the conversation. So we have three phenomenal experts in the areas of labor, skill development, and regional development. I'm pleased to introduce Meg Gingrich, the Assistant to the National Director at the United Steelworkers Canadian National Office and the President of Blue Green Canada. We have Tricia Williams, the Director of Research, Evaluation, and Knowledge Mobilization at the Future Skills Center. And we have Dr. Tamara Krawchenko, an Assistant Professor at the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria. She is also the Assistant Director to the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems. So we have a number of questions for our panelists to kick off the conversation. Alex, I'll hand it over to you to ask our first question.
Thank you very much. So I'm actually going to put my first question to Meg. Meg, can you talk about why we actually need legislation like the Sustainable Jobs Act? Why is the status quo not enough?
Well, I'm just going to sort of build off of the presentation that you just gave and all of those recommendations, those excellent recommendations on what we actually need if we want to have a plan that will allow us to create and maintain good jobs in a clean economy. Without any legislation in place, it just won't happen. We'll either be left to the market trying to do it on its own, where they're not going to, it just won't happen in the way that we need it to. Or if there's simply environmental regulations without a job strategy that's attached to it, we won't see that side of things be very robust in terms of ensuring that we're maintaining, creating good jobs. Now, C50, as you've said, creates the framework to do this. On its own, it won't do it. But it does create that framework. And it is, we characterize it as more of a jobs bill than anything, but a clean jobs bill and one that ensures that unions are actually at the table and have an entrenched place in the planning process. And so all of those policy recommendations that you were just talking about, that you've heard from workers, will have a place on this partnership council with legislation in place where we can actually continue to raise these and hold the government to account in ensuring that this actually happens. I would say that as it stands, Canada's approach to planning has been very disjointed. There's many different government, aspects and parts of government that are involved or could be involved, and they're not always as coordinated as they could be. And so again, ideally, this allows for a coordination between departments and initiatives with accountability. Now, we're going to have to make sure that this actually happens the way that it needs to, and that unions, I come from the labor side, obviously, so that's really where my concern is on this, to ensure that unions are at the table and have a voice, and that it's heard, and that there's actual policy that comes out of that reflects what workers need, and it's not just sort of, something where workers are just there, you have a place, and we're not listened to. We need to make sure that it actually is enforced properly.
Thanks so much, Meg. I think you made a really great point about the need for follow-up and a robust implementation. And so that leads me to the next question. So I'm wondering, what are some of the policies and resources we need to see in a sustainable jobs plan? And so I'm going to ask Tricia and Tamara to weigh in on this one. Maybe Tricia, you can go first.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me today. And what an interesting presentation. I was furiously writing notes because I think so much of what you're talking about resonates with the work that Future Skills Center has been doing with partners across the country. And first of all, I'm just so glad we're having this conversation, because I think, as Chris noted in the opening remarks, like bringing those conversations together around labor and climate is so essential. And like, we are just scratching the surface, and we have so much more to do on this. In terms of what we need to see in a sustainable jobs plan, I mean, I think I would highlight two things, both of which came out in your presentation already. One is which, we need to make sure that things are not cookie cutter and that we allow for localization. And actually, when I looked at the attendees on the webinar, I'm like waving virtual hellos to like people we've worked with across the country. And I think there are such great examples of people developing localized solutions. Like I know Sandra Moore is on the call from Clean Tech Academy in Prince Edward Island. And I think that's such a great example of like working with the demand and needs in the local sector. The second thing I'll say before I'll turn it over to Tamara is we really need to make sure that there's coherence between those policies. So you mentioned the set of policies for workers and then the set of policies that are kind of more structural or systemic. And I think what we're observing is that sometimes these two sets of policies are working in a disjointed way. So for instance, if we're going to encourage people to take up heat pumps, we need to make sure we have the skilled workforce to install those heat pumps, right? And we, I think there's, there's different streams of money that kind of direct the pots for all this, and we need to do a much better job of making sure that it comes together to actually provide good opportunities and jobs for workers.
Great. Yeah, Tricia, those are great points. And I'll just building off what you said, I'm going to focus my remarks on what this means as for governance and for policy implementation. So just looking around at this panel and many of the people on the call, first off, I wanted to say, you all fed into this process, and it's fantastic to see this act now making its way through and, in the Senate in the third reading now, and just so much advocacy and work went into this, and I think it's a really good piece of legislation. It mimics a lot of the leading practices that we see globally, and I think it's going to be closely watched by others. So what does it actually do, though, and what does that mean for resources, policies and resources? So it creates some important governance mechanisms, as was mentioned, the Secretariat within NRCan, and then the Partnership Council, which will be industry, workers, Indigenous peoples, energy transition experts, and so on. And then they're going to have these 5-year action plans, and then they'll have a progress report every 2.5 years. So there's these accountability mechanisms in there. There's this engagement and dialogue. I read a lot of strategies, government strategies and action plans and stuff like that. The quality matters, the dedicated resources matter, the indicators matter, and some of the best indicators that I've seen have been developed through dialogue processes. And I really hope that's what we see in this case. If you think about what this means for the bureaucracy, so you have this act, and ministers are going to have to be responsible for things. And I'm thinking that ministers in their mandate letters are going to see this. It's going to show up in different ministries. And they're going to have to report on what they're doing. And that includes skills development, economic and social measures, measures that support workers individually, regionally, within community and sectorally. And so if you think of some of the big stuff, like our existing programs and key agreements, like the $3 billion bilateral labor market development agreements and the workforce development agreements, if you put this lens on those agreements, and that's what I think this act will do, then you're going to see these mechanisms and these resources flowing from that. And so I just think that that's how this is going to maneuver and work, and that the federal government has a lot of key levers, of course, but many ones that are missing, and that's how those policies will be aligned, and that's how they will be funded. The key things, of course, are labor market and skills training, and as was mentioned, the social security system, innovation funding, business support, and some regional development and economic development. Infrastructure is a really big one. Final remarks, though, just to say, we can look at how these things have been operationalized in other countries. Someone mentioned private investment. You know, in the European context, they created this Just Transition Fund, which is essentially regional development money. They have an Invest EU scheme, which is a budgetary guarantee to mobilize private sector investments, and then a loan facility. So in terms of the actual resources, those are some of the things that we could be talking about that would be really, really helpful in implementation.
So we're wondering what a sustainable jobs plans means for workers in high emitting sectors. Of course, there is, no shortage of controversy with this bill. And I think some fears among workers that what this actually means is that their jobs are going to, be at risk. So can you just talk a little bit more about what the act itself and what a sustainable jobs plan actually means for workers?
Sure. Yeah. And so I think like there are sometimes worries from workers, and I think they're very, very legitimate. And I think that, our members we represent members in every sector of the economy, but a large portion of our membership is in high emitting industries, heavy industry, and extractive industries. And they're legitimately worried that their industries are under threat due to policies meant to reduce emissions, because they are, like, frankly. And so I think that what we need to be sure of in developing policies, this legislation and concurrent policies, is to ensure that one of the most central aspects of it is that there is a place for a robust manufacturing sector and even extraction in Canada. And that's the position of the Steelworkers. That these are all things that are essential to building a cleaner and greener economy, whether it's the materials for building retrofits or for rail or for whatever it may be. As part of that, this is an essential component. And if we're not, creating the jobs here and maintaining those jobs here in those industries, we're going to still need all of these materials from somewhere and from somewhere else, where often the labor and environmental conditions are much worse. So having legislation and policies that recognize that central place of these jobs in Canada is extremely important. And we need to make sure that we have plans around that, so that as we are aiming to decarbonize or reduce the carbon impact of heavy industry and the environmental impact of extraction, that we're ensuring that that jobs are maintained in those sectors, and that communities continue to have jobs. Oftentimes the types of jobs where our members work are their community supporting jobs, or their single industry towns, or those types of things. And so workers are absolutely, they express concerns about the impact of environmental policies, like, quite frankly. And so, our job as a union, and my job as president of Blue Green Canada, is to try to find ways to bring these things together with member input, to ensure that that these types of jobs are part of a plan going forward for a clean economy. Because if they're not, you're not going to get support of workers on it.
Thanks so much, Meg. Next question I have is for Tricia. So we want a little bit more about what Future Skills has to say about where Canada's workforce is actually heading. I'm wondering, what kinds of jobs do you expect to see in demand in a clean economy?
Oh gosh, summarize years of research and pilots into a few minutes is hard. I mean, I always like to joke that I'll pull out my magic crystal ball, right? Everyone wants that crystal ball, but I think it's becoming increasingly clear that, we have to do some myth busting. And I think, as you pointed out in your modeling, we did similar research last year in partnership with the Smart Prosperity Institute that actually modeled 3 different potential pathways to net zero targets. And in each scenario, so confirming what you found, every scenario was a net job creator, right? So we have a pretty good idea that there's going to be more jobs. We also know that, that isn't going to be smooth. There absolutely are going to be disruptions. And Meg, I completely agree, like people, I understand the fear, right? And the sense of, the intense economic pressure that households are under right now. And thinking very much about their own financial security and livelihoods. So we know there's going to be an issue of disruption, but at the same time, we're facing a whole bunch of demographic shifts, including, retirements and demographic changes, changes in the kinds of jobs people want to do, and people really saying we want better jobs. So when we look across the economy, we see a lot of jobs that frankly require significant levels of skill investments. And skills, of course, is not a short-term tap. You can't turn it on, off at will, as much as we like to think that it's, you can put people through a 6-month or a 12-month program. Often it's years of training and investment in skills, which is why it's so critical to echo that point you said about, we can't just pick this up later. The time is now, and it's not necessarily an expense item, it's an investment. My position is we're going to pay now or we're going to pay later. I'd rather invest now and see the dividends in our economy, in our workers, in our environment, and the outcomes. And really, I think it is going to take that mapping at a regional level. So Calgary Economic Development, for instance, is doing phenomenal work right now and really assessing what are the talents and skills that are in the workforce in the Calgary region, including in the oil and gas sector, and then mapping where are the new opportunities going to be in Calgary. And that's going to be different in Calgary than it is going to be for other areas. And so really that kind of workforce planning, we've really seen some very forward thinking, working with unions, working with community leaders to think about what's coming next. The last thing I think I'd say in terms of the skill areas is we have to really think holistically about the kinds of skills that are needed. So there's obviously a big focus on technical skills and, like knowing very technical things related to, sciencey things that are not my forte, right? Sciencey things, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously very important. But we also know that like increasingly in an era of automation and, working with a whole bunch of new technologies that we can't forget the importance of like cross-economy digital skills, not just in the IT sector, as well as social skills. And we really see that the half-life of technical skills is much shorter than it used to be. So that's the rate at which you have to keep learning to keep things up to date. And so if anything, we have to really make sure that we're doubling down on that. And in general, I think I'd say, we did some research that really pointed to that Canadian employers are not investing in skills development nearly as much as OECD peers. So this is really a clarion call, I think, for unions, for workers, for everyone to say we need to step up that kind of investment in training. And now is not the time to walk away from that.
I wanted to jump in on something that Tricia said, talking about the skills training. And I would also say that a key part of this is recognizing the skills that workers have, for example, that they've received on the job, but may not be on a piece of paper. And there are ways in which we can do that. There are ways of recognizing those skills. And that is a really essential piece to what's going forward, because a lot of workers have a lot of on-the-job training and a lot of skills that they've developed over the years of doing that job and doing that job safely that you can say on a CV, but frankly, when you have a designation that can be attached to that or some sort of recognized credential can really be quite powerful going forward. I did want to move on to a different prompt, which is talking about the roles of provinces, territories, and communities here. Tamara touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm hoping Tamara might expand on that.
Yeah, thank you. This is my bias because it's like what I do. I do place-based policy and regional development. So, but we know that transitions, they are inherently place-based. They have place-based features. They look really different in different places. Different places have different capacities. You can think of a place that has a economic diversity, a diversified economy versus one where a single industry dominates employment. And if you think of a transition, depending on the type, it's a whole different, kettle of fish. So the key policy levers also, a lot of the time, they are provincial, territorial, or local. I also want to explicitly note the role of Indigenous governments in transitions. So just as one example, in British Columbia right now, we have a call for power, which explicitly states that there has to be 25% Indigenous equity ownership in renewable investments. So there's kind of major players and they're major players, and how they manage these processes will be critical as well. So it was great to see in this act such an explicit recognition of local and regional needs. It's listed right there as one of the key principles. And what's also really nice is that it recognizes accounting for the cultural values, strengths, and potential of workers and communities. And we have really different types of economies across Canada. And if you look at GHG emissions per capita, we know that the challenge is going to be much greater in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And so there's really a regional development approach embedded in this. It's recognizing territorial differences and I think inequalities as well. And maybe what we're going to see in implementation is some instruments that actually deal with those inequalities. In terms of what this looks like, so the federal government is involved in regional development. They have regional development authorities across Canada that generally do business and innovation supports. They don't do so much in community investment. They also, if you think of things like infrastructure funding, well, that's huge because there's a whole bunch of incentives that they can put into how they do infrastructure funding that have a major impact on regional development. But then so many of those levers, as I said, are provincial, territorial, or other governments, Indigenous governments. And we need to think about the different capacities of different places to manage interventions. And what I mean by that is some places that are lower capacity, remote, rural, where a challenge is much bigger, they're going to need much higher interventions. And we're going to have to think really seriously about how they could be supported. I want to highlight this point by giving you a typology of 3 type of transitions, because I just want to indicate like how this can look really different. So think about this ideal typology. Think about a place where you have industry or sector decarbonization, where there are innovations and investments to reduce GHG emissions. And you can think of something like the decarbonization of steel production. In that instance, the industry is not being replaced, it's being transformed. So it's going to need things like innovation, R&D, capital investments to meet these objectives. That might impact the nature of the local regional economy, community well-being, but that economic activity, it's going to be in the same place. That might be retraining and skills, but it's really different than some of the other transitions. Then picture this. This is a big one. Industry phase out and replacement. A shift clearly from one high-emitting industry to another, but related industry. For instance, offshore oil and gas production to offshore wind. There, the interventions are often targeted to workers and industry. The broader community could be impacted, but the economic activity remains in that region. And that might require large capital investments, and it can impact land and the environment. But again, a lot of the people and capital and infrastructure can remain. Then this is a tricky one, industry phase out. And we went through that with coal. And then the intervention is economic diversification typically. And a lot of this happens in rural and remote economies that are already kind of single industry dominated. And that's huge. And that's it's very risky. It requires long-term strategies, many more interventions by all levels of government. So I just want to give that as an example of how place matters and how the type of transition matters, and the levers and the instruments that we use to support and manage that process are different. And it was great again to see that recognized in that act.
Thanks so much, everyone, for your insights right now. I think At this point, we're going to turn to some of the questions in the chat, and my colleague Lawrence is online from the Pembina Institute, who has been shortlisting some of the ones to ask to our panelists. So I'm just going to turn it over to Lawrence to field some of those for our panel.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. So one of the questions I've got here actually came in from Meg during our webinar. Some people were able to submit questions when they registered. This is one that's just come in over the last 20 minutes or so. So Meg, someone has asked here, is there a difference of perspectives when it comes to the union rank and file versus union leadership when it comes to sustainable jobs or net zero economy? How do you overcome major differences in perspective on climate change between union members and union leaders? Really interesting question. Over to you.
Yeah, and I'll try to answer this as quickly. I could go on about this one. But so first of all, like the Steelworkers are a union that represent workers in every single sector of the economy that you can imagine. So of course, our members have a range of views on climate change and what the best means of action is on that. Our leaders are elected. They're all elected from the membership as a whole. One member, one vote. Most of our elected leaders come from either heavy industry or mining. I'm staff, but I also come out of the membership as well. And so, as elected leaders, they have to take the position, that's set, our policies are set through, again, a democratic process. Policy conferences where we vote on, where members submit resolutions on our policy direction, and then our leaders and staff take that and sort of form policies and speak to the needs of the membership based on that. So of course there will be people within the membership who have different views, but we do our best to reconcile all of those different views and take into consideration the policies that are explicitly proposed by and passed by our membership. And so I would say that, the leadership is acutely aware of both the need for action on climate change and reducing emissions, but first and foremost, we need to protect our membership and the jobs that our members are in. And so the positions that our leadership take, are basically a way of reconciling all of these things. Like on this particular issue, I'm doing our best to try to find a way to maintain jobs for our members in the industries that our members are in while taking the necessary action on climate change. And you'll always have people who disagree and things like that, but on the whole, it is representative of what our membership wants.
Thanks. If we have time for another question, I'm actually going to bring up one that also came in live here since we started the webinar. And it may be one best for Tamara with your place-based perspective. So the question is what do you think, or what are maybe some of the early indicators of what could be viable, net zero aligned industries in rural and remote communities in Canada?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and our rural and especially remote economies tend to be extremely resource extractive. When you talk about transitions, any rural, depending on where the rural community is, but certainly remote place community, they know these ups and downs, they live them, and they see how hard it has been. And so my answer to that is I'm trying to find out. I'm doing research in northern BC to try and find out more about that, and particularly the role of energy within that. I'll be doing that next year. So maybe I'll have better stories to tell, but I often see that it's regional development processes or community development processes where you're thinking like, well, what are our assets? What are we really good at? What kinds of major capital investments and infrastructure do we have? How can we pivot? What kind of investments we need to be successful? And this notion of sustainable jobs, but also sustainable communities in the broad sense of the word, where you wouldn't have those ups and downs because they're devastating. And we have so poorly managed them in a Canadian context. We've had so many industries come and go, And we tend to generally only manage that reactively with labor market supports, interventions, presuming that people will move. And then we often just leave communities to die, if I'm honest. That has been the strategy. And a final thing I want to say, I recently looked at all strategies, policies, and programs for every type of every single ilk across every province and territory in Canada to look at how they treat rural, remote, and northern communities. And in almost half of the cases, they ignore them. And that includes all of the resource development strategies and policies. So we need to think better about place. And the places we can learn from that do that well actually are the Northern Territories.
That's great. Thanks for that, Tamara. I know, Tricia, you wanted to weigh in on this question as well.
Yeah, and I think Alex has thoughts too, which is good. I'm glad we have thoughts on this. So this is exactly what we were looking at. We released some reports earlier this year in partnership with Smart Prosperity, and saying, you know, we're going to have industries that replace this. Obviously, there's energy components. You know, just last week I was speaking with Electricity Canada and some of the leading employers in that, and the thousands of jobs, 28,000 new opportunities by 2028 in electricity alone, right? Some of them are remote and rural opportunities, line transmission, maintaining the grid, but of course you have to learn how to translate skills and validate experience that you've gotten on the job. As Alex said, like there's a mechanistic part there that we have to solve in the labor market. The other thing we've been looking into are, you know, some of the new growth industries that will arise out of net zero transitions. So the mass timber in northern BC. I don't know if that's been on your radar screen, Tamara. There was even just, we released a report with Smart Prosperity on mass timber and kind of labor demands forecasts. There's a lot in the news about electric battery manufacturing in Ontario, but also plant proteins in the prairies. Like these are new areas of growth that offer potentials. The other thing I think I'd put on everyone's radar screen is just how much we need to be thinking about the labor force in the renewable sector. And, you know, I think it's something like 30% of the renewable sector workforce is eligible for retirement in the next 10 years. Right? That is huge amounts of talent that is just going to demographically be lost. This is a generation that kind of came into the workforce in renewables in the 80s or 90s. And then, you know, they've been working away and there hasn't been a huge demand for increase in renewable workforce. So again, these offer opportunities, but people can't take advantage of them if they can't, you know, have some way of showing that the skills they've learned and gained in other industries are relevant, that employers work with them on that, and that there's supports for training and for recognizing your talents, and that, you know, we make those things available to people.
That's great. There's a lot of interest in this question. I'm gonna turn it over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks so much. I was really glad to hear Tricia talk about mining and processing, as well as agriculture and agri-food, which are typically both rural and, in the other instance, remote community support or community industries. I would encourage the person asking this question to also think through the fact that it may not always be exclusively rural and remote, but there's also an element in which there are communities which are sort of, you know, mid-sized, where there has typically been one industry that's kind of been the bedrock or the anchor of that community or town, and ways in which we can learn from how other jurisdictions are dealing with this. So in the American IRA, there is a piece of policy called the Energy Community Bonus, or the Energy Community Benefit. And essentially what the Energy Community Bonus has done is it said, if there is community X in the United States that's been typically like a, you know, X percentage of the workforce, or the, you know, the sort of economic action areas tied to, in their case, mostly coal. We don't have that in quite the same way, although that is still a live issue. I would encourage people to remember that the coal transition is not over, and we have obligations to coal workers. But the Energy Community Benefit says there's an added bonus for locating new investments in the communities where they've typically been focused on these high emitting sectors that are not, you know, that are in a situation where they're not adapting. So saying to at the government level, it's not the regional economic development needs to be targeted to the communities that are being hardest hit by the impacts here, so that those communities can continue to thrive and to be viable, because it's about those workers. But I would say it is also about all the other workers that are in that town. So if you work in the grocery store, if you work in the public library, if you work in the hospital, if you work in the parts supply store, all of those things are then impacted by that core, that like sort of anchor employer, right? And so the more that government policy can focus on making sure that we strengthen and maintain that workforce, the more ancillary benefits there are beyond that.
Awesome. That's all the time we have for questions. Back over to our hosts to help us close out here in a good way.
Thanks so much, Lawrence. And thanks everyone for submitting your questions. My apologies we weren't able to get to yours. Just because we're about 2 minutes away from the end here, I just want to turn to each of our panelists, Tricia, Meg, Tamara, to answer the question, why is it important that we get this right? Why is it important that people stay engaged on this topic of sustainable jobs? Just any concluding thoughts that you might have for the folks online today, and we'll wrap things up from there. Maybe I'll go with Meg, Tricia, and Tamara in that order.
Sure. Okay. So I'll try to be quick again. I think if we don't get it right, we risk, job and community loss. Quite frankly, I think we end up with a counterproductive climate policy where, heavy industry and those types of things are shut down. But it doesn't do anything for climate overall because you still need those things to be made and produced elsewhere. Workers are already a little bit worried about action on climate change because they worry about the impact on their jobs. Not engaging workers means that you're not going to get this right and you're going to lose support for this and not gain the support that's needed to actually have the outcomes that we need, the good material outcomes for workers that we need through all of this. And I think I'll also just say one last thing, that I think that when you have workers who are really opposed to this and don't trust in the ability for government to actually do this properly, you do see it. There's a direct link to the rise in reactionary politics that we see across our country. And that's extremely dangerous for all of us.
Yeah, I think I'll just say we can't get it wrong. This is a critical moment for Canada to maintain our standard of living, our economic productivity, and keeping workers at the center of that is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, what more can I add? I'll just say one thing. This is about the economy of the future, and if we don't participate in that economy, it will really harm us long term. And so other nations are moving ahead with innovation and investment, and that is going to be the future economy, and we need to be there, and we need to make sure in doing that we deliver well-being and address inequality so that we can have territorial cohesion and competitiveness.
That's a phenomenal place to end. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists for your insights and your expertise. And thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. We will be following up with a recording of the webinar and links to some of the reports that we discussed. So I'll ask everyone to have a wonderful day. And again, a huge thank you